OTAs this week for the Ravens and Owings Mills, and then next week, mandatory camp. And I'm sure John Harbaugh will be happy to put some pads on some purple players. Of course, over the weekend, we lost the greatest, the most famous man on earth, Muhammad Ali, passed, and I am chasing down people who came in contact with Ali, told stories about Ali, or can tell me stories about Ali. A very, very rich life with great details, and it seems like everyone has a different story. I'm reaching out to the best storyteller I know, one of my favorite people to have on the program. His time's always valuable and limited. We get up to Rye, New York, and welcome in the longtime president of HBO Sports. He's now at Ross Greenburg Productions doing all sorts of hockey stuff and Ken Griffey stuff and even working on something on Lawrence Phillips. But I think he's told a million stories about a million athletes, and I'm sure, Ross, there's nothing that compares to telling the story of Muhammad Ali. It's perhaps the most famous, well-told story, but there's still stories out there to be told, and I'm hoping you have some of them. How you doing, Ross?
I'm doing well, Nestor. Great to be with you, and I have a lot of Ali stories. I think every documentarian has done at least one segment of his life in a different way, and when I was at HBO, we did One Nation Divisible on the story of Ali Frazier 1, which was probably the most significant fight, other than maybe Louis Schmeling in the history of the sport. That was a great project. We really enjoyed putting it together. It kind of set the tone for who Ali was, coming off of the 3.5 years of exile and facing Joe Frazier, who had supplanted him as a heavyweight champion at that time. Both undefeated, both claiming to be heavyweight champions of the world, and both were regarded. And then all of a sudden they meet in the ring, but before that they spent 6 months to a year becoming symbols for the anti-war movement and the pro-war movement, for the younger generation and the older generation, for civil rights. And actually poor Joe Frazier was deemed to be, the Uncle Tom. It was quite a time. It was an historic time. It was a revolutionary time, and only Ali could really get through it and come out as a loser in the ring, but a winner outside the ring. What a moment that was. But I had other personal stories with Ali as well through the years.
Well, I mean, in putting together work, in trying to portray that story and tell that story, I would say the 3.5 years of exile for Ali, that's a story that hasn't been told so much, maybe through writers' eyes at that point, and a lot of it's a little bit stilted by the war, by the Archie Bunkerization of America at that point. My wife saw the latter-day HBO piece from a few years ago about how their lives turned, and Ali's selling rights for $75 million. Joe Frazier's living above a gym. Not penniless, but certainly not wealthy in that way. And it goes back to all of that racial divide in America. And when he died the other day, my wife and I had a long conversation on Saturday about. She really had a bad taste in her mouth about all of that and how it was portrayed in that film. And I said, well, you have to take yourself back to that time. I would think at that point it really was about selling tickets, right? This was the first end of Vince McMahon using, a guy in a Nazi uniform and Sergeant Slaughter to sell tickets, or using Puerto Rican guys and Polish guys to try to sell tickets in ethnic communities. That's part of pay-per-view and forking over big money to go down to dilapidated arenas to watch closed-circuit fights from Zaire and from Manila. Part of getting people out was stirring them up, and the race calling card and the war calling card was all part of selling tickets, right?
Yeah, and I think no one was more genius at it than Muhammad Ali, and you hit on it, Nestor. The fact is that the boxing business had changed the way people watched sports television at that time, so that you were supposed to go to an arena or a stadium in order to watch on a big screen and plunk down your $20 per ticket or whatever it was in order to have that privilege. And people, thousands and thousands all over the country, flocked to the arenas and the stadiums for these Ali fights. And the only way to get people to do that, instead of just having them sit in the comfort of their own living room, was to sell. And that was the genius of Muhammad Ali. That's why he was the greatest promoter in the history of the sport, even though he's never given a promoter's license. In fact, he knew what he was up against, and he knew that he had to kind of be the bombastic crazed kind of personality that he was in those press conferences, and he'd have to get under the skin of his opponents, which effectively worked, and that most opponents were beaten by the time they got into the ring because of his antics and intimidated by his bravado. But never Joe Frazier, by the way. But the fact is that was Ali, and that was the genius of Ali. You know, I even heard Don King recently on an interview discussing the genius in his promotion, and there would have been no Don King or any of them if it wasn't for Muhammad. So yes, you hit it right on the head. That was the real genius of Ali.
Well, from a business standpoint, you owe a debt of gratitude to all that as well. I mean, at HBO, all those years you're there, the pay-per-view became a staple, and a pay-per-view only happens when there's that kind of interest. And in order to get that kind of interest, playing the race card was about all they had, other than I'm going to beat you up and you're going to beat me up. They wanted white people to come out and pick a side too, right, at that point?
There's no question. And, I think that there was a double-edged sword to the whole pay-per-view world that boxing lived in, because now I think we're seeing the remnants. Without an Ali and that kind of character, it was very tough to keep the pay-per-view boxing world going. And now with no more, Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao, it's going to be a long time before we get the kind of, crazed kind of generation of boxing fans who flock to their homes and plunk down that kind of money, given the fact that there's no electric superstars in the ring anymore like an Ali. So that's the difficulty here. But Ali set the stage. He lived during the glory years of boxing because he created the glory days of boxing. And, guys like Sugar Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler and Mike Tyson, who came immediately after Ali, were given the grace of Ali's presence, and they were given that business to kind of generate a new decade or two of greatness in the ring. But but the sport is changing quickly, and we'll never see the likes of Muhammad again, and we'll never see the likes of that era in boxing again.
Your whole life you've done storytelling. I mean, that is your art form. I don't think anybody's ever done it better than you on a video platform. And it's Saturday morning, I wake up and Ali's dead. And, I went back to my story of when I met Ali one time with Jerry Eisenberg at the Super Bowl, where he sat and watched Tyson fight on one of your pay-per-views, by the way, back in 2000. And I was really struck all day long, and I'm still struck by not just the long-form writing on Ali by Hunter S. Thompson or Dave Kindred or Mark Cram 30 years ago, but by writers who woke up on Saturday and saw Ali had died, and immediately on their day off, not with an assignment, not because the boss was yelling for it, but just wanted to sit over a cup of coffee and write down whether it was 12 inches a copy, whether it was a memorial, whether it was 140 characters on Twitter. Everyone had something to say about it, and it was also rich. And I think from a media perspective, in what you've done for a living, what I've done for a living forever, those Cosell Ali interviews or whatever they were that turned into some sort of theater, completely unrehearsed. And for Cosell to ask that tough question, everything emanates from those conversations as to how we even react to media and athletes these days, and what a press conference looks like, and what filling up a notebook represents, and what profiling an athlete would be about. Everyone looked to portray Ali in a certain way, and upon his death, there's a story that you can pick from, whether it's the war, race, the South, the Olympics, lighting the Olympic torch, political figures, Ali sparring with Fidel Castro, across all of that. But what an incredibly sad story if you were to do the documentary now about his life, about a man who never spoke a word the last 2 decades of his life after doing nothing but speaking. There's something really Shakespearean about his life, right, Ross?
Well, there is, but I'll tell you a couple of unique stories. First of all, I had the pleasure in 1982, and it's the only autograph I ever got, to be honest, but I met him, 5 or 6 times at different screenings and such. But in 1982, I was naive enough at the age of 27 to think that I could get Ali and Frazier in a studio in New York for HBO.
Wow.
On a show I was producing. And I reached out to both, and believe it or not, I was probably the first person to get them together in a studio since those hectic days when they fought in the mid-'70s. And so,
well, Cosell tried at one point. They were wrestling on the set, right?
Yeah, oh sure, that was when they were selling a fight. But years later, this is seven years later, I actually got them into an HBO studios at 23rd Street together. It was the first time that they were together since, and I'll never forget that day. The first thing that happened was Ali shows up, and about 500 people, when he got out of the car outside on 23rd Street, had learned that he was coming, and they were kind of waiting for him on the sidewalk, and they besieged him, and we were about a half hour late in shooting because basically Ali was entertaining about 500 people right outside the studio because he was like this magnet of charisma that I had never seen before or since.
And he couldn't help himself, right? He never walked past the crowd. He would stop, literally,
yeah,
right?
No, because he loved people. And so that day, he was in and out a little bit. He was starting, believe it or not, in '82 to kind of suffer.
Well, he had just fought Berbick, right? I mean, we weren't far off of that, right?
Yeah, it was just a year after Berbick and 2 years after the Holmes fight. But he was really starting to suffer, and he hadn't announced the disease till 2 years later. But the fact is that it was the only time I asked for an autograph. It hangs in one of my rooms at home, and it says, "To Ross the Boss, Muhammad Ali," and it has the date on it. And I've never asked for an interview from an athlete before or since. But the fact is that the many times I saw him later, he was not able to verbally communicate very much, although he whispered in my ear a few times. But I was able to communicate with his kind of the way he was with people in a public setting, even without the ability to open his mouth. It was fascinating to see him engage. He would use magic tricks. He would use different ways to try to endear himself to the public. And, it was just love affair with people. It was captivating to watch. And, it was as if the Pope walked into the room when Muhammad walked in the room. I mean, it was a different feeling. I've been around the biggest stars in the history of sports, but this was different. This man was totally different. He was, so transcendent and godlike, even though he didn't like to use that word because of his respect for Allah and all of that. But it was amazing to see the respect that people had for him.
Well, and I guess in his death and the fact that he hasn't really been in the news and hasn't been public, I think there is a whole generation, certainly people under the age of 25, that maybe watch an MMA or maybe think of him as, like me in the 70s, I remember the fat Elvis and I sort of remember the fat Ali, right? I mean, I was born in 68, so I don't really have Thriller Manila thoughts. Mine was more like seeing him fight Spinks, right? And when he fought Jimmy Young down at the Capitol Center, I had people in my neighborhood, I was 8 years old, 9 years old, that went to that. I didn't see the best of Ali, but in trying to explain to a 10-year-old kid or a 12-year-old kid or a 15-year-old kid today what Ali represented, I think the weekend of television, it's just really complex. It's not something that you can wrap up in a 30-minute little piece, the story of Muhammad Ali. It's far more rich than that.
More rich because he was so complex, and he changed as a man. I mean, at first he was a militant black Muslim who basically was, trying to explain that blacks had been, harangued for so many years, hundreds of years, and that the whites had tromped on, the black soul for all those years in America, and he was going to lash out. And then all of a sudden he had this reawakening. And as time went on, he looked at the world as a brotherhood, and he stopped being angry, and he started to be a peacemaker around the world, and he looked on, his role using boxing as a platform to do just that as he gallivanted around the world, first in doing fights in Zaire and Manila and Kuala Lumpur and all these places, but then as an ambassador to the world for peace, harmony, and love. And that was the first complex issue. Obviously, before that, you had the Vietnam issue, and he chose the right side in most people's minds now that we look back at what was, a war that never needed to be fought. But at the time, you have to understand, coming off World War II and the Korean War, the country wasn't in the mood to get behind a war that no one wanted. The country was in the mood to always defend America, right or wrong. And Ali just stood up to it. And, greats like Cosell and others backed him and fought the good fight with him because he was a man of such principle and conviction that you knew he was fighting for what he truly believed in, and you didn't doubt that, even though Jim Brown had to collect, a dozen African-American athletes and test him one day to see if he was true to his convictions, and had him come to a huge meeting that few people really remember today, to try to find out. Jim once told me to find out if Ali was being real or if there was some fakery going on as to why he didn't want to go to Vietnam or enlist. So, he's a very, very complex figure, but at the end of the day, he will live on beyond what Babe Ruth even stood for as the greatest ball player ever. Ali was this combination of the greatest fighter who ever lived, certainly the greatest I ever saw in the ring, in watching the Cleveland Williams fight in his prime, because you have to also understand this man was robbed of 3.5 years of the prime of his boxing career. If you look at the Cleveland Williams fight, and very little has been said about this.
That's 66, right?
Yes, and that was just before the exile and, conscientious objector. And in that fight, that was the greatest living fighter I have ever seen in my life enter a boxing ring. The speed, the power, the artistry, the athleticism, all combined into one person. And never before had a heavyweight had that kind of speed, skill, power, and dominance in a prize fight ring. And if we had seen that fighter for another 3.5 years before the Ali Frazier 1 fight, yeah, God knows, this would have been like, think of Jordan if we were stolen 3.5 years in his prime with the Chicago Bulls. I mean, I can't even describe to you the kind of fight he fought against Cleveland Williams. Yes, that wasn't Joe Frazier. It wasn't a slouch, though. And he just ripped him apart. I mean, you could have put 10 Foremans and Jack Johnsons and Joe Lewises in front of him on that night, and he would have torn through every one of them.
Well, and then when he came back, the heavyweight division was so crowded in the early 70s, and there was so many quality fighters. Let me put it to you this way, Ross. I mean, upon his death, we talk so much about CTE in football. We're talking about it now with girls soccer and head injuries. I mean, there's a part of boxing for me where when Ali, as you said, in 1982, now we're going back a long time, was exhibiting these problems, and then Tex Cobb and how Howard Cosell felt about that. I don't think there's any question as to why boxing has died. It's because people didn't want their children to box, right? And meanwhile, MMA's making all this money, and it's far more violent, far more bloody, and I can't imagine how that long tail is going to look. But seeing Ali die with Parkinson's, live with this for 3.5 decades. It really does speak to boxing and why boxing has trailed and gone away, because this is what happens when you get hit in the head too much, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a reality, and, I think pro football is going to have to start mining itself and looking into their rule books and taking out the collisions and taking out the kind of violence that exists on the playing field, because you're right. I mean, all of these sports, boxing, football, even hockey and others are going to have to look to take all this out, because, kids are not going to be allowed to play. And if kids aren't allowed to play, then they're not going to grow up to be professionals. And so, the sports will die. So all of them are going to have to develop in a, quote, civilized society, and we're going to have to get into the artistry of all these sports. Unfortunately for boxing, it's the end of the sport is, the end of play in any given night is destined to be a knockout, which is laying someone unconscious with a concussion. So that's a real problem. That's not the goal of football and scoring a touchdown, or, in lacrosse scoring a goal, or in hockey scoring a goal. So So that sport and MMA are in serious trouble long term. I would agree with you. The long tail effect of those sports are in big trouble. But the fact is that I think the others can be changed, and not for the worse. You know, there's this stupid misnomer that by wussifying these sports that you're taking away their beauty and artistry. But I seriously disagree with that. When you look at the game of hockey, which now has no fights in the playoffs, is the most beautiful show on earth as far as I'm concerned. And when I played football, you know, I was a wide receiver, so I tried not to get hit that much. But the fact is, the artistry that's put out there on the field by quarterbacks, wide receivers, and running backs is unmatched and can exist without being violently, you know, hit at 90 miles an hour by 300-pound people.
Ross Greenburg joining us here, longtime president of HBO Sports, now with Ross Greenburg Productions, doing some hockey stuff. You can follow his journey out on Twitter, Ross Greenburg, and the number 1. One of my favorite guests to have on. You're working NHL now, right? I mean, we talk about that. I love hockey, as you know. We've sat at a few hockey games together, and I thought my Caps had it all going. I thought you'd be chronicling them. Instead, we're watching them golf and watching Pittsburgh do what they do. But you're doing a lot with the hockey space right now.
Yeah, well, Showtime has me five shows following during the Stanley Cup playoffs and into the final, which is happening as we speak. Every Friday night, we're broadcasting a 30-minute show that chronicles the week in the NHL. And so now we're in the final, and it's very exciting. We're behind the scenes. It's an all-access show. And I don't think anything in the history of televised sports has ever allowed cameras behind the scenes at this level in order to showcase playoffs this deep. And we're having a hell of a good time. The Pittsburgh Penguins and the San Jose Sharks have allowed our cameras in. We're low on the ice during the finals and enjoying every second of it. And the only harrowing thing is putting all this footage together to a half an hour every Friday night in a 7-day turnaround.
Yeah, trying to turn it around quickly. That's that's the art form, right?
That's the art. And I've got, you know, a staff you wouldn't believe of editors and shooters and producers that just have been doing this for years with me. And it's just a wonder to behold the beauty of what we put together every Friday night.
Ross, it's great having you on, man. It's always great tracking you down. Hopefully we'll get a game in at some point somewhere between New York and D.C. And I know you're working on a Lawrence Phillips thing, too. I'll let that settle. Anybody from Baltimore would have a story about Lawrence Phillips, who almost became a Raven. But certainly you're talking about a life full of tragedy and a really sad story to tell.
Yeah, we're calling it Lawrence Phillips Matters because it's a life that needs to be explained and dissected so there's never another situation like this again. Certainly people don't know the full story and they need to. But he's one of many stories out there. Unfortunately, you know, his was a tragedy and hopefully there'll never be another like him off the field, and there'll be plenty more like him on the field.
You keep telling him, I'll keep watching him. I appreciate the time as always. We'll see you on Friday night watching your NHL Showtime series. Thank
you very much, Nestor.
There he goes, Ross Greenburg, one of my favorite guests to have on, longtime president of HBO Sports, telling some Ali stories amongst other things. You can reach me out in the Bahia Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. Just download the TuneIn Radio app. We come in crystal clear. Our morning newspaper hits your email inbox every morning, right around 7 a.m. That's all powered up by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. And last but never least, breaking news happens first on your mobile device these days. Sign up for the WNST tech service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. I'll be signing copies of Purple Rain 1 and 2 this Saturday at Black Eyed Susan in Glendon. Come on up, say hello, eat some chocolate, and get Dad a Father's Day gift of purple magnitude. And I don't mean Prince. I mean the other Purple Rain. That's the Ravens' Purple Rain. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.